recording. Okay. Um, and we're gonna start by talking about where we are. So about a year ago, the congregation approved a foundational vision and 7 commitments. Our task force began work about 11 months ago to flesh out key commitment number 5, which is, as it says at the bottom, to adopt a more nimble and sustainable congregational governance model that allows members to devote their energy to mission and spiritual growth. And the chart here just talks through the various updates and feedback opportunities, the white papers that we issued in January. We want to thank all of you, many for participating in those feedback sessions, for sending us comments. We want that to continue, for reading the white papers, and then for submitting questions for the Q&A. All of that work culminated then in the development of a resolution that the congregation voted on February 26th of this year to approve the new governance structure and authorize work on the bylaws revisions to begin. The goal being then to vote on updated bylaws at our annual meeting on June 11th of this year. Okay, so what have we done so far? Well, one of the first issues that we examined as a task force is, what is the difference between a constitution and bylaws and policies and practices? The last time our congregation updated our bylaws 4 to 5 years ago, we, like most nonprofits and churches, separated those two out. So we have our constitution and bylaws, and we have our policy and practices manual. So what's the difference between bylaws and policies? As it says here, bylaws outline the big picture. They set the general parameters of the structure. They articulate important objectives. They define roles and responsibilities at a high level. They may talk, especially with the church, about how the church was formed, when and how how elections are held, what's the process for setting up committees. Any change to the bylaws requires a congregational meeting and an affirmative vote of the congregation. Policies are described then how those bylaws are implemented. They are organizational practices. They address things like board member responsibilities, conduct, define conflicts of interest. They define financial management policies, human resources practices, and they can then be more easily modified by an affirmative vote of the governing board. So one of our distinctions was to look at all of the proposed changes in the white papers and in the resolution and say, what is bylaws and what are policies? Now, most of what's in the resolution is bylaws, as you will see in the following slides. Another guiding principle for us was to make the fewest changes possible to affect the desired outcome. Now, clearly, this is a big governance change, so there are a lot of changes. But if our proposal and the resolution didn't address a topic, we left it alone. And you will see that sometimes people have looked at the bylaws and said, why is this language in here? And my answer has been, that's what was in there. In addition, we deliberately preserved areas that assert the primacy of the congregation and the local church, while adding language that, per our white papers and the resolution, that gives more autonomy and freedom for experimentation to ministers, to staff, and our lay leaders with responsibility for operational and missional activities. So to draft the bylaws, we used first the resolution that was approved by the congregation. We used the white papers. We used feedback and questions that we'd received at the second hour session in early February to incorporate new language into the bylaws. And much of that is literally verbatim from the resolution from those white papers. We've met 3 times with our lawyer, Douglas Zucker, and I will say he is wonderful to work with. Very experienced in religious organization governance. We have worked through 2 drafts of the bylaws to date, and tonight what we're sharing are details of draft 3. Okay, so against that backdrop, and we are not going to walk through each of these, but just a little background on how a constitution and bylaws, and specifically our proposed draft for the constitution and bylaws, is organized. It's organized by articles on the broad topics that just many of which I described when I talked about what bylaws seek to accomplish. We added a couple of new sections. One is Article 9 on the authority and responsibility of active members. That is a section, as Sally will explain, to clearly identify the authority of the congregation, of our members. We added a new section on the executive director. We added a new section on ministry and ministry teams that is essentially a replacement for the section we had in the previous version of the bylaws on leadership teams. And you will see references, but no need to memorize this. This just gives you a general idea of the flow. So when we go back to the resolution, what did we actually approve? And as you recall, it was 2 pages. It was a lot of whereases, but this is the kernel of the actual motion that the congregation approved. And it states, therefore, be it resolved that we, the congregation of Union Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, hereby officially authorize the initiation of implementation of the overall framework for governance and ministry structures developed by the Governance Task Force and endorsed by the Leadership Council, consisting of. And at that point in the resolution, we had a series of 14 bullet points describing specific elements of that framework. So what we're going to do now is walk through each of those bullet points and show you where and how that element of the framework is incorporated into this draft of the bylaws. Oops. Okay. Sally?
All right, I'll pick this up. So the first one, or that we, really incorporated in our work was to create a philosophy and principles of governance and what that means for us. So to start things off, we outlined that the governing board, clergy, and executive director should operate within a consultative, collegial, and inclusive environment. That is in Article 10. Outlining that the United Church of Christ, the local church, is the basic unit of organization, Article 6. The mission of the congregation is really outlined in our statement of purpose, and that is approved and supported by the congregation. That's covered in Article 3. There is explicit communication and feedback loops between the congregation and the governing board, which we outline as being essential to successful governance and ultimately our mission. Governance is exercised by a governing board comprised of church members, which is elected by and accountable to the congregation. That's in Article 10. And continuing on the governing board, it's ultimately responsible to the mission of the church in partnership with clergy and the executive director to achieve the church's mission. Additionally, through policies that governing board delegates to clergy, staff, and ministry teams, the ultimate authority, power, and resources to carry out that work of the church. And the governing board, clergy, and executive director will operate in a consultative, collegial, and inclusive environment. And we will jump into some of these in more detail in later slides. So the new structure consists of the concept of explicit powers reserved for the congregation and delegating all other matters to the governance structure. Additionally, it consists of an expansion of the explicit powers reserved for the congregation, which includes approval of the annual mission priorities each year, as well as approval of any changes to the mission. So that's the statement of purpose. So these two concepts really are made up in a new article in our bylaws called Authority and Responsibilities of Active Members. So we go into much more detail in that specific article.
Oops, hold on.
All right, and we have a view of it here. So Article 9 is that new article, Authority and Responsibilities of Active Members. And ultimately, it's saying the legislative and administrative power of the church is vested in the membership, which assembles in congregational meetings. Only the membership in which a quorum of active members can do these things, right? And some of the things that are new are the ability to approve annual mission priorities and adopt and revise statements of mission or purpose. The other items on this long list that we don't see highlighted in blue are really carried through from the current bylaw, so current powers of the active members. So ultimately, other matters, which you're not seeing listed out here, are delegated by those active members to the governing board.
And let me just interject, we know these are very wordy. Don't worry if you can't read everything tonight. We will be sending this presentation out on Thursday.
All right, so the new governance structure consists of quarterly congregational meetings to solicit feedback from the congregation on strategic questions and missional priorities. So this is really covered in Article 12, and it's outlining that there will be at least 4 congregational meetings held at regular intervals throughout the year. And the purpose of these quarterly meetings will be to solicit input from the congregation on missional priorities and the key strategic questions facing the congregation. So really that feedback loop between the congregation and the governing board are really important for successful governance and understanding the priorities out there. So additionally, it's outlining that the governing board may call additional congregational meetings or schedule congregational meetings prior to the annual meetings in order to approve the annual mission priorities and or elect the slate of incoming officers, at-large members, youth members, ultimately to provide a little bit of transition between overlaps of outgoing governing board members and really to create some time for planning. So that is now written out in detail in the bylaws. And this governing board, we have outlined that it will be a board of 9 members, 9 voting members, 4 officers, so moderator, vice moderator, treasurer, and secretary. There will also be 4 at-large members and 1 youth member made up of a high school junior or senior. And clergy and executive director also serve on the board with voice but no vote. So since our last update and in discussion with the lawyer, we have learned that there's a law in New Jersey which states that essentially no member of a board can be under 18 years of age. And so the trustee of the board must be at least 18 years of age. And so due to that, we have added language into Article 10, Section 3 that mentions that governing board members must be 18 and above to be a voting member. And so if there is a youth member who is not 18, they will have voice but no vote until their birthday, at which point they will have the ability to vote at age 18. So that is a change since our last update, and that's in line with state law. And the new structure will consist of a focus by the governing board on mission discernment, strategy, and the development of written policies. So ultimately, Article 10 goes into the governing board itself and is outlining that the governing board is made up of active members who are elected by and ultimately accountable to the membership. It's responsible to the mission of the church in partnership with clergy and the executive director to achieve the church's mission, and ultimately shall act for the congregation in matters not specifically outlined for the membership, but really focusing on governance, strategy, long-term planning, oversight, management. And so it is responsible for that management and oversight of the congregation's human, material, financial assets, and resources. And it does that by setting policies for operations and ultimately, health and safety of congregation, clergy, staff, visitors, guests, and our financial and material resources. Ultimately, as well, the governing board delegates the authority to carry out the programmatic, spiritual, and administrative work of the church to the clergy and the executive directors, which includes staff and then also ministry teams. And the new structure consists of a focus by the governing board on mission discernment, strategy development, and the development of written policies. So outlining in more detail, it's mentioning that the governing board should be facilitating congregational discernment around mission and vision, establishing strategic plans and goals, working in partnership with clergy and executive director to ultimately ensure that resources and assets are being used to fulfill the outlined mission. And that really gets into that development of annual mission priorities, which includes that process of congregational involvement and feedback in quarterly congregational meetings to really focus on creating those priorities.
Okay. So another key element that was identified in the resolution in February was the importance of standing committees. These committees would be appointed by the governing board with the purpose of supporting the governing board and working collaboratively with the executive director. So that is established in Article 13, and it states that all of these standing committees, task forces, groups are appointed to advise and assist the governing board in goal setting, policy making, and oversight, to handle special projects, address particular needs, but not to supervise church staff or ministry teams. They operate under the oversight of the governing board. Appointments to standing committees are for 1 year and can be renewed at the discretion of the governing board up to a maximum of 6 years. So as we did in the white papers, we have identified a number of standing committees in the bylaws. Section 2 describes, and this is the high level description. There will be more detailed descriptions in the policies book. But each full-time minister will have a pastoral relations committee, as they do today, with similar functionality. It's an advisory group and a support group for the minister's leadership. There's also a finance and investment policy committee responsible that helps the governing board, the treasurer, and the executive director in their oversight of the congregation's finances, gives feedback on routine financial reports to ensure clarity in reporting, participates in audits, responds to requests for information and analysis from the governing board. They're really a research wing for the governing board. Assists as needed with preparation of the draft budget, the drafting of church financial policies and procedures, and reviewing financial contracts. In concert with the executive director and treasurer, this committee reviews operating income and expenditures during the year for deviations, significant deviations from the budget. They also provide oversight for unions' investments, our investment policy guidelines, and they make recommendations to the governing board for any changes to investment policies. Okay. They don't participate in day-to-day financial decision-making or operations. Anybody appointed to this committee needs to be an active member of the congregation. The Human Resources Committee assists the board and the executive director in developing personnel policies and procedures, ensuring compliance with applicable laws. As the research wing, again, it may gather information on human resources questions and help develop new job descriptions or review existing position descriptions. Again, to be a member, you must be an active member of the congregation. And the committee, as a standing committee of the governing board, isn't engaged in supervision or personnel decision-making. Building and campus care looks at evaluation of the campus, recommends needed projects, does the 5-year plan for maintenance, as we hear each year at the annual meeting. Again, may do analysis and research related to maintenance and use of the campus. They're not involved in the day-to-day decision making. And members of this committee can be active members or friends. As we know, the status of the nursery school is somewhat in flux. As we stated in the white paper, we think the best place for the nursery school at the moment is as a standing committee. So this committee would assist the governing board and executive director in developing and evaluating nursery school educational and program policies. They might gather information on new school policies, assist with evaluating current and alternative school models. And you could be a member or friend on this committee. And then additionally, the resolution included an element stipulating that we create a leadership discernment standing committee responsible for nominating governing board officers and members, identifying and recruiting ministry coordinators for worship and music and justice and community engagement areas and other areas as needed, and supporting the congregation in discerning their own spiritual gifts. So Article 13, Section 2 creates the Leadership Discernment Committee and identifies what it is to nominate for. It mentions that this committee may also help to identify and recruit ministry area coordinators and team leaders as needed. And then further in the article on ministry and ministry teams, it specifically charges this committee with helping to identify and recruit ministry area coordinators for the worship area, for the justice ministry area. Continuing on with the third bullet up here, in Article 13, it charges this committee with engaging regularly with the congregation to help members and friends discern their spiritual gifts and provide opportunities for members and friends to participate actively in the church's ministry teams. During the Q&A session and the discussion, we had some questions about the procedure for selecting the Leadership Discernment Committee and the size, etc. So we have included in the bylaws a paragraph stipulating that this committee consists of a minimum of 5 active members of the congregation who are not members of the governing board. There was interest from the congregation in maintaining those separately. I should note today that In our current structure, nominating is a bit of a hybrid or an anomaly. It is a standing committee, but unlike any other standing committee, it is elected by the congregation. And we have maintained that distinction here. So the Leadership Discernment Committee is a standing committee, but its members and chair are elected by the congregation for a 3-year term, a single 3-year term. Okay. Ministry teams.
All right, so the new structure consists of ministry teams, which do the ministry of the church and really creates a voluntary, flexible structure for these ministry teams. So these are outlined in Article 16. A summary here is showing that, ultimately these ministries are the work of the church that support the church's vision and mission. And they are made up by ministry teams who are ultimately doing the hands-on work, and that relies on a spirit of volunteerism and discipleship. These ministry teams are overseen and guided by the ministers to ultimately achieve those specific tasks. And those ministry teams are essentially receive their responsibility and authority to focus on those specific tasks through the governing board's delegation of responsibility and following policies by, enabling the ministers to work with those ministry teams. So ultimately, they're composed of members and friends who are interested in or passionate about any specific ministry task. These members and friends will choose the ministry team on which they wish to serve and may, participate in as many ministry teams as interested. There are no term limits for ministry team members, and there's no membership approval needed to serve on these ministry teams. Based on the specific task, the size of ministry teams may vary. Some will be small, some will be large. And ultimately, those specific teams have, the power, if you will, to set their own schedule for meetings and how to accomplish their ultimate task. So the new governance structure consists of delegation of authority and primary responsibility for day-to-day operations of ministry to the clergy. So clergy will oversee the ministry areas and ministry teams with oversight from the governing board, and the clergy therefore are delegating responsibilities to the ministry teams while retaining that oversight for those ministry teams. So that's outlined in section Article 10 in terms of the delegation of authority there from the governing board to the clergy. And in Article 14, it's saying that the ministers oversee the ministry of the church and the ministry teams, making those day-to-day operational decisions that aren't already given to the membership or the governing board. And, outlines that delegation to ministry teams. Article 16 outlines the responsibility and authority for the ministries that ultimately rest with the governing board, which is guided by the membership approved statement of purpose, the missions of the church. And that responsibility is exercised through policy and delegation of responsibility to ministers. And the new structure consists of delegation of authority for day-to-day campus, financial, and personnel operations to the executive director. So this is outlined in Article 10. The governing board, through policies, is delegating the authority, power, resources to carry out the administrative work of the church to the executive director. And in Article 15, it's outlined that the executive director is responsible for all aspects of the administration and operations of Union Congregational Church, and makes operational decisions related to campus care, finances, human resources, communications that aren't already explicitly given to the membership, governing board, ministers, or defined further in policy. The new structure also consists of limits on clergy and executive director authority. And so through governing board approved personnel and financial policies, that goes into detail on hiring, dismissal, evaluation, and financial oversight. And the clergy and executive director are ultimately evaluated by the governing board. So that's outlined in Article 14 in terms of the ministers and adhering to approved policies and practices and hiring and working in consultation with the governing board. Ministers will solicit input from relevant stakeholders, with ultimately making the final decision. And governing board is responsible for supervision and evaluation of senior minister. That's outlined in Article 10. Article 15 also mentions the executive director adheres to all governing board approved human resources, ultimately policies and practices in consultation with the governing board. The ED is soliciting input from relevant stakeholders and retains final decision on hiring practices. And the governing board is responsible for the supervision and evaluation of the executive director. That's defined in Article 10. And the new structure, it consists of accountability to unions, mission for all. So that's the statement of purpose. This is covered quite a few places in the bylaws. So all of the statement of purpose is now in Article 3. The mission of our congregation is the focus of the church's organization. That's stated very clearly in Article 3. The governing board is responsible to the mission of the church, partnering with clergy and the executive director to achieve the mission. That's Article 10. The minister is leading the congregation in its mission to the wider community and world. Article 14. Ministers are accountable to the mission of the church and to the congregation. The executive director is accountable to the mission of the church and the congregation in Article 15. And the ministries of the church comprise the ongoing work of the church in support of the church's vision and mission. That's Article 16.
Okay, so those were the 14 elements of the resolution of the new governance structure. We've also made some modifications to the bylaws based on questions and comments that we received as part of the earlier feedback sessions. So I'm going to go through some of those now. A couple folks pointed out to us that we needed to be thoughtful about changing the name, the title of president to moderator and vice president to vice moderator. So we consulted with our lawyer who looked into the statutes, which, as is highlighted here, indicate a corporation can provide alternative titles, alternative to president, secretary, etc. And that the alternative titles, I'm sorry, let me start again. They can provide alternative titles provided that the certificate of incorporation, or as we are doing here, bylaws specify which other officer titles correspond to those, to the president, secretary, etc. So in our proposed bylaws, in the section, in the article on officers, we state clearly in section 3 that the moderator corresponds to the president, to the position of president, and in section 4 that the vice moderator corresponds to the position of vice president. So in the view of our lawyer, that covers us with respect to that issue. Comments on membership. Going back to the beginning when we said our guiding principle was to change as little as possible, we have not proposed any changes to the qualifications for membership, requirements of members, voting rights of members, in the definitions of active or inactive members. As you know, we currently have a task force on membership working on those, and we anticipate that they will come at a later date with proposed bylaws changes for those, but we wanted to respect their work on that and not touch it. In that membership section, we did define, include a definition of the congregation, kind of a big tent definition, which states that the congregation is defined as all active and inactive members, clergy, and friends of the church. We also then distinguish very carefully throughout the bylaws between congregation and membership, which is defined as active members with voting rights. So certainly all of those decisions where it talks about the authority of the membership, those voting on those issues is limited to active members with voting rights. We retained the definition and the welcoming language to friends, which is in our current set of bylaws. And then because we discussed in our current bylaws roles and responsibilities of friends with respect to teams and governing boards, etc., we had to revise that. And here's the new language. Friends are invited to participate in the church's ministries, serving as members and or leaders of ministry teams and or as ministry area coordinators. Friends shall not hold voting rights at any congregational meeting of the membership, nor may they hold any office subject to election by the membership or be appointed to certain standing committees of the church as specified in Article 13. Another question that was raised as when we were holding some of our feedback sessions, and this question basically came from folks that work a lot with the finances of our church, was that we needed a clearer definition in our bylaws about what the budget and the budget is. And the Financial Sustainability Task Force, their findings were suggesting that our current threshold for expenditures in excess of the approved budget without requiring a vote of the membership was too low. So currently our bylaws state, obviously the members adopt the budget. And then they go on, this is what's currently in there. However, the council may expend funds beyond budget limits so long as the aggregate of such expenditures during a fiscal year does not exceed 2% of the church's operating budget. And of course, if you exceed that, then authorization must be obtained, or if you think you will exceed it, by a vote of the, excuse me, by a vote of the membership. The proposed language from the Financial Sustainability Task Force to update this is the same as the beginning. Says, however, the board may expend funds beyond budget limits without approval of the membership, provided that the aggregate of such expenditures during a fiscal year does not exceed 4% of the church's annual budget, which shall include the nursery school budget. Authorization for board expenditures in excess of the 4%, of course, would have to be obtained by an affirmative vote of the membership at a congregational meeting. So that's language to address the concerns in our current bylaws language. Another minor change resulting from legal review is to strengthen the requirements with respect to notifying the congregation of potential property sales to conform with New Jersey statutes. So the proposed language is that notice of any congregational meeting where the membership will vote on the sale or other disposition of real property of the church must be signed by the moderator and the secretary or by a majority of the governing board members. Currently, only the secretary has to sign that notice. So that just brings us in line with this statute. Okay, is Katrina here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't see anybody. So
Yeah.
do you want to talk about the section on
Yes.
ministers?
Absolutely. So this was again an area where we wanted to make some change in the language to basically give the congregation more flexibility in the future without changing the sort of substantive intent of the section. This clearly came up last summer when Dave resigned and we did not have and do not have a senior minister. And so, there had been a clause that those duties can be delegated in the event of an absence, but also recognizing that there are churches using different titles like lead minister or co-pastors. And so seeing this as an opportunity to give that flexibility without binding us to any specific language in the future. So you'll see the first section, there shall be a senior minister, and the proposed change is there shall be a minister, sometimes referred to as senior minister or lead minister, and the same sort of definition of the role. That person, that minister, would supervise, direct, and evaluate other ministers. And then we wanted to include sort of that flexibility to say that the membership may call or hire clergy with a variety of titles, and a number are listed there: senior minister, lead minister, minister, designated term minister, etc. And that they can be, and some of this was already in here, they could be full or part-time. They could be generalists or specific to a certain area. And then the last thing was to add some language about a covenant. So this is, part of our covenant with the wider other settings of the church, that the membership has a call agreement with the pastor, but the pastor, the minister, also has a covenant between the church, the minister, and the association. And so that's just a standard way of being in relationship, recognizing that there is accountability on all three parties. And we just didn't have anything about that in our bylaws. And I think that it would make sense to include that to ensure that we're maintaining that covenant with the association setting of the church too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we do have some slides here on officer descriptions and duties for officers, hence 4 slides, maybe 5. If we can go through these, we can skim through them pretty quickly. You want to give us a sense of if we want to kind of go quickly through some of this, we can do that.
I think, Catherine, there's some questions that came up in the chat that we might want to go back and address before we move into these roles. What do you think?
Well, what we're trying to do, because we're recording the presentation, Carlos, is get through the entire presentation and then saving questions. And that, yeah, we said that at the beginning, that we would hold questions till the end and encourage people to put them in the chat so we can pick them up at the end. But we're going to we only have 3 or 4 more slides. So then we'll open it up to discussion. Okay. I think we can go through this one. Sally, do you want to talk through these? I think we can skip through and pretty much just go through these pretty quickly, and then maybe talk a little and go through in a little bit more detail the treasurer one.
Sure thing. Yeah, if I skip over anything that you want to call out, jump in. So we'll start with the moderator. Most of the language here is pretty similar to what's in place in our current bylaws in relation to the president position. Obviously, the term moderator has been changed in these bylaws, but ultimately that role itself is very similar to the current description. Going into the vice moderator, and so this is really taking the current vice president position and adding language to support the leadership that the vice moderator will be expected to give towards that annual and long-term visioning, mission planning process. So ultimately, that vice moderator is responsible for scheduling, planning, executing those quarterly congregational conversations in order to really ultimately end up with mission priorities approved by the congregation. Secretary role, so I don't think there was a lot of changes here either. Ultimately responsible for notifying governing board members of the meetings and potentially serving as a witness on contracts signed. Otherwise, I think most of the language here is very similar to what is currently in the bylaws. And the treasurer section, Article 11. So the treasurer is responsible for the care, custody of the funds and securities of the church. So the language changes here are really talking about the treasurer as sort of oversight on financial policies and procedures, working collaboratively with the executive director. Ultimately, continuing to give a full report of the financial condition at each annual meeting. And I think there's another slide that goes into a little bit more detail about the responsibilities of the treasurer in collaboration with the executive director and the finance and investment policy committee to really put together the annual budget and financial plans for consideration by the board and membership. So the treasurer is acting as a liaison to staff on financial policies. The treasurer is exercising oversight of finances and investment policies, investment decisions, and working closely with the executive director. So ultimately, the day-to-day operations are the responsibility of the executive director and staff. Oversight is part of the treasurer's responsibility there. So I think that, really covers it, and I'll turn it back to you, Catherine.
Okay. So next steps are, this is tonight. We will also review the draft and this presentation with the Leadership Council next Wednesday. We are asking for comments from everyone by May 7th. And the reason that we have put a deadline on it is that then we will take all of that input, revise draft, and submit it again for legal review. So in terms of cost efficiency, we'd like to be working with all that input at that point, and we will post an email, a revised draft of the Constitution and bylaws to the congregation. May 23rd is, and then we have, it says tentative here, but we have actually scheduled another Zoom session on May 30th. It will not be a long presentation like this. It'll be a Q&A and basically explain any changes in the drafts between now and then. All of that then leading up to a vote on the proposed bylaws at the annual meeting on June 11th.